Hello, I'm Terry Gesualdo, and welcome to La Dolce Audio. In our first introductory video, a commenter in one of the comments um, mentioned how that video seemed like a fireside chat. It was just a conversation. It was meant to be informative, just telling people that wanted to know what La Dolce Audio is all about and what we're doing. How we do it, well, that's a little more complex, and that's why more videos are being made that will explain those three areas a little bit more. But that fireside chat comment got me thinking. There's a lot of things that I cannot or don't want to put into instructional videos. And recently I've been making a series of videos about open baffle speakers, because DIY open baffle products is what we make, and we design open baffle speakers. And the reason we do that is because I discovered, you could say, or saw a gap in the market. There was a place in the marketplace with open baffle speakers that nobody was filling. At the time, Lee Audio was pretty much just making single full range drivers. And then they added to that, I think it was called the W15 and W18, which were bass drivers to augment their full range drivers to get the depth of bass and some of that. And, you know, they were very smart designs, so that was fine. But there's a little bit of a gap between that kind of full range speaker and what Siegfried Linkwins made, which I think, you know, I consider him the grandfather of open baffle speakers. So what he did was innovate and tried to make probably near perfection, you could say, open baffle speakers. But his speakers still are very complex, and they also were very limiting, you know, in what you could use. But when you're talking about at least, you know, he had 5 drivers in a speaker, and it was a 3-way system. And then he did active crossovers because of what he needed to do was so complex, but that by the time you make a passive crossover, it just didn't sound nearly as good as an active. And the active crossovers can be some of the best crossovers, but they're also the most challenging. I know because I worked with them when I was as a sound engineer. I worked for a few years as a sound engineer, which gave me some background that I didn't realize was going to be so useful in all of this. But that just made Siegfried's speakers so complex that they were just beyond what I wanted to do. So I was going with Hawthorne Audio speakers at the time. Although Siegfried and I had some amazing conversations, in-person conversations at Burning Amp, many years in a row. And all of the things that I would kind of discover, I'd run by him to see if is this right? Can this be the way I'm thinking it is? Because this is what I keep testing it, and it keeps coming out this way. And he was so kind and so nice, and he was excited to share his knowledge with open baffle speakers. And he's the one that really, you know, taught me a lot. And, you know, when you consider the word genius in this hobby anyway, there's a lot of geniuses. Arnie Nudell, Bascom King, Dave Wilson, Nelson Pass. And they may not have been the most educated or the most in-depth intelligent, although some of them were extremely intelligent, but they were very creative in finding solutions to many problems that we have. So today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I kind of fell into. And well, I was Alice in Wonderland, and I fell into a few rabbit holes, and I found myself in these worlds that I had never intended to get into. And then that got me thinking about other things. And so I don't want to get into all those details in a open baffle explanation video. Um, so I thought, well, let's start making vlogs, and we could talk about these things in the vlogs. And my thing is, I'm not going to be an authority here or whatever, but it's going to be food for thought. You know, and how can we do that? And how can we go further with some of this stuff? So let me tell you about one of the rabbit holes I found myself that I fell into, and that I'm like, oh my goodness, there's no bottom to this pit. Literally, it's going places, and you can tell that by the applications of it. So let's just get into it. What the first rabbit hole I fell into, yeah, there's more rabbit holes. The first rabbit hole I fell into was psychoacoustics, the science of psychoacoustics. That's right, it's a legitimate branch of science. Now, to have anything be considered a science, you have to have at least one thing, and that's it has to be measurable. You have to have some way to quantify what you're talking about in order for it to be a branch of science. And that is where I think psychoacoustics is starting to begin to struggle in some ways. In other ways, it's not, right? And so psychoacoustics basically covers about 4 areas, right? The first area is, so first let's define what psychoacoustics is. Psychoacoustics is how humans perceive sound. How sound comes to us and how we hear it and how we perceive it. Now, like a lot of animals, we need to hear in specific ways, and we need to hear, you could say, specific bands of frequencies better than others because of how we are and what we do. And, different animals hear differently. Bats, dolphins, even cats. Cats can hear high-pitched sounds, and dogs that we cannot hear. And you can use those, we do use those to help train them. So how we perceive sound is kind of based upon how we live in our world that we're, in. So we, a lot of this world, because humans are a little bit different, they don't find themselves in worlds, they create their own. You could say that our hearing maybe is tuned into certain things, but we hear differently than animals, very differently, and we'll get to that. So with psychoacoustics, there's 4 areas. 1, frequency and pitch perception, right? And that is, what is it? What's the range of human hearing? And how do we hear within that range? So that's frequency and pitch perception. And oddly enough, our frequency and pitch perception is very much in tune with music itself. And that's why, one of the reasons why, we enjoy music so much. The second area is loudness perception. And that's interesting. That's based upon some studies that were done in the 1940s or 50s. I can't remember exactly your range, by two guys, and it's named after him, the Fletcher-Munson curve. And so all the receivers made in the 1970s and many of them in the 1960s had a loudness control. I loved Yamaha's loudness control because it was variable. You could vary how much loudness you wanted. And, although I don't know how any of you that have had a Yamaha receiver or integrated amplifier, but I always turned it all the way up because of the range that I listened to and in. So that's a thing. And when you turned it up, it created more of a U response, a U-shaped frequency response. And as a result of that, that's kind of how we like to our hi-fi to sound. And so then that's the 2 areas: frequency and pitch perception, loudness, and then masking is one. And that is how similar sounds close in frequency can mask one or the other, or both to a degree to where you don't hear as much detail. And that's where MP3 quality really kind of came to the fore, because their lower, um, their compressed sound, digitally compressed sound, basically took away a lot of spatial information. So they just took that away. And so when it comes to that kind of perception, that relates to the fourth and final area of psychoacoustics, and that is spatial sounds and localization. That how humans localize sounds and how they perceive spaces because of sound. And so they're kind of closely tied and within the same branch of psychoacoustics. So this area of psychoacoustics, I really begin to get kind of deep into trying to figure it out. It's probably maybe a small fraction am I going to share in the Open Baffle series of videos, because not all of it applies to Open Baffle. Some of it does, some of it doesn't, to some degree, more or less. So there's going to be some of that there. And the reason why you have to get into that, I'll explain in the Open Baffle series. But that was the majority of any talk that Siegfried Linkwitz gave was all about psychoacoustics. And so he talked extensively about it. So you cannot make a video explaining Open Baffles in any degree of accuracy unless you first talk about psychoacoustics, the science of it, and how we as humans hear. But what gets me is this led to something else that I started to think about. And that's not in psychoacoustics so much, but you would think it would be. And that is the emotional impact of music on humans. And for whatever reason, you don't see that emotional impact with other animals. At least I don't. Unless they have some sort of attachment to a sound. If they hear, like, sure, if an antelope on the Serengeti plains hears the roar of a lion, it's going to evoke emotion, right? Because of what he knows that means. That something's pretty close, that's quite dangerous and life-threatening at the very least, or it's a lethal presence. So there's that. And so, but what I'm talking about is the range of the pleasure and pain of what we hear in music, right? But also, and this is where I thought, I'm surprised this isn't a part of this, but it's very much a part of what I do. And I'm going to explain that. And that is, there's two types of pleasure and pain. There's the type of the music itself. The music is just like movies can be very happy and light. It can be much more deeper and moving and evoke some tears. Or it can have what I call a goosebump factor, where the music is so moving that you get goosebumps on your arms, right? But that goes hand in hand with another pleasure pain cause. And I think that's what audiophiles are chasing after to some degree. And that is the system itself. For me, music is like therapy. And so the pleasure pain aspect of it all has a lot to do with having a system that doesn't get in the way of the music, but lets the music come through, lets the performance be realized. And that's where that kind of spatial perception and localization of sounds helps a little bit. And I think Siegfried knew that as well. But well, that's going to goof up the one-take video. So you can have a system where its sound can ruin perfectly good piece of music. It can have such negative qualities in the sound, or it can be so limiting that things just don't come through. That that's not there. And so with some of this, one of the things that I kind of term, and I think other audiophiles too do too, is the engagement factor of a system. And it's been said that, well, before I make that statement, I want to make one point, and that is I think there's a difference between hi-fi and high-end, right? In the beginning, I pretty much feel like we started off with hi-fi. And the reason why is because companies like Electro Voice and JBL and a lot of companies started out kind of both. They made speakers and then they sold components. And so I have a lot of, because I used to have a Electro Voice website, vintage Electro Voice loudspeaker website I had. And I ran that when GeoCities was a thing, and because it was free. And it was completely donation based, much like Wikipedia. And I would just collect data sheets and everything on Electro Voice speakers, vintage Electro Voice speakers, because there was no information on the internet with that. And then Electro Voice itself, Telex, the parent company, started posting. They just made it available to everybody. I don't even know if it's still there, but you could go on there and get any data sheet with any speaker that Electro Voice ever made in the past or even current. And so it made what I was doing a little bit obsolete. But I had a lot of copies of year by year those catalogs that Electro Voice produced in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And I had a lot of copies, and still do, of many of their speakers that were DIY. The Gregorian, the Regency, the Aristocrat. I mean, these were great speakers. The Patrician. I have multiple versions of the Patrician. And they stopped making all that DIY in the 1970s. By the 1980s, Electro Voice was no longer a DIY company. But that's when things were hi-fi, right? The goal was higher fidelity. But somewhere in the 1970s, hi-fi started to morph into high-end, right? And that was kind of just because of how the whole hobby was going at the time and things like that, and who was being introduced into the hobby more, because some of these bankers, you could say, that weren't handy with woodworking or other things, or even running a screwdriver or electrical, they would have their brother-in-law make the speakers for them and help them with things and stuff. But one of the last companies to go out of the DIY business, I think, was Heathkit. Back in the 1980s, Heathkit was still going pretty strong, and you could buy a lot of things, and you could make your own signal, sound generators, signal generators, and things like that to work with things. So anyway, fortunately for us, a lot of things kind of made a resurgence starting in the 1990s, and is still very much alive today, although it kind of vacillates a little bit. It seems like in the 20-teens, a lot of the DIY stuff started to drop off, and now it's coming back. And so that's a good thing. And so it's easier for companies to make components for DIYers than to make a end product. And so for me, that was my life, hi-fi and DIY. And that's kind of what got me into this, but I didn't want to abandon it. I didn't want to make high-end, very expensive stuff. So I'm trying still to keep the DIY aspect very much a part of all this. But getting back to the psychoacoustics thing of the pleasure pain, and that is, there's no branch of psychoacoustics that talks about what is it about sound that can be pleasurable or painful. And in the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s and continuing through the 1980s until things started to change in the 1990s, there was this distortion wars and specification competitions and stuff like that with manufacturers. And that's when things got really interesting with regards to a lot of this. You know, that's when things that probably shouldn't have happened started happening. So you could have a Japanese Techniques receiver like I had that had amazing specifications on paper, but not sound very good. So specifications themselves don't correlate with the good or bad sound in a system. And there are some rather harmful things in systems. One of the things is like this MP3 files. Everybody's kind of familiar with those, but that masking of low-level detail and spatial information really kind of, it was done to make files smaller and more compact for these starting off with iPods and the other listening devices where you put computer files. It's just so you can put more music on them. And a lot of people, because of how they were listening with headphones, didn't need or want that spatial information. It wasn't portrayed very well. You know, it didn't come through on headphones. So, you know, thus came these various compressed files. And then, because of that, audiophiles rejected them. And so for all them to start to be used now for audiophile listening, to make that branch of things kind of expand, they needed to make lossless files, no compression. And, or at least if it was, you're not going to be missing the spatial information. So this is the first in a series of vlogs that we're going to call Fireside Chats. And if you want to, in the comments, comment on what is it about hi-fi that makes it sound good, that makes it sound engaging, that allows the emotional impact of the performance to come through. What do you think that resides upon? I think it's a combination of several things, and we can talk about those in another video. But this whole branch of science of psychoacoustics, if we could quantify that one aspect, and then it could be repeatable. That's why I think vacuum tubes are just as popular today as they ever have been, if not more. That's why I think people gravitate towards speakers without crossovers, such as single drivers or full rangers. I think that's why also some music in the audiophile world is we gravitate to, you know. So, but when you're a person like myself who listens to music because it's therapeutic, it's something that will reset your emotions and help you get over negative emotions, I think that's pretty important, because the last thing I want to listen to is a hi-fi system that ruins a recording, or a hi-fi system that's painful to listen to. And I have personally discovered certain things that I feel contribute to that. And I think there's beneficial distortions for that, and there's negative distortions for that. But to be able to have the lowest level detail in a system, you have to get rid of some noise. And that's where compression is the enemy, whether it's file compression or whether it's audio compression within itself. Now, that doesn't mean that particular instruments, to bring out their tonality, can't be compressed to a degree, you know, even vocals. But it does mean overall, if you start compressing an entire song, it makes everything start to sound homogeneous, and all the spatial information gets clustered in there, and your whole soundscape collapses to where you have to recreate it, so to speak. And you can do that with mixing, you know, of music, but I think there's better, more preferential ways of doing it. And that's where some of these hi-fi, high-end recording studios have really figured some of this stuff out. And it's much more complex making that soundscape in a recording than you might think. Anyway, that's our first fireside chat, and we'll talk about other subjects as we go along. And these aren't going to be so much instructional as they're going to be explorations in ideas.